Hello everyone, welcome back to the Indie Fantasy Club. Today we're going to be diving into something a little bit different. My very first comic book, Unicorn, the Vampire Hunter. Now I did warn this author when they reached out to me that I am probably horribly unqualified when it comes to reading comic books. Like I said, this is literally not just the first fantasy comic book I've ever read, but really the first comic book as a whole that I've ever read. But I'm always happy to try new things, so I was happy to give it a shot. It's actually not too long. It only took me a couple of days to actually finish the story. So it's actually pretty short in comparison to my normal reading material. So that was kind of a nice change up. And I think this author has published maybe a few different comic books, but I don't think that they're related. This one seems like there will be a sequel. I don't know if that one's been released yet. So let's talk a little bit about the premise of this story. This book takes us on a journey of a prince cursed to live as a unicorn. This man exiles himself to the outskirts of a distant village and basically hunts vampires to protect the locals. The story kicks off when he saves a young woman from a vampire attack and subsequently reunites with an old wizard friend of his. What follows is a tale of curses, redemption, and navigating broken relationships. So with all that context in mind, let's dive into this indie review. When it comes to immersion and the world building, I really did think that the imagery would help boost the experience. But I actually think for me personally, it had somewhat of the opposite effect. So I ended up giving it a 6.5 out of 10. I'm not really sure what I was expecting with a comic book, but to me, it just felt like the world building and the immersive nature of fantasy as a genre was kind of lost a little bit, and it just seemed a little bit flat. You do get a good sense of the different races and how they interact, some of the conflicts that exist, the history of the witch hunters and the king, and the relationship of the vampire brothers and making him an inventor. Those were all really cool concepts, but I really just feel like we just skimmed the surface of all of these things. I think there's a lot of potential with the story, but just not enough depth. And as a fantasy reader, I just want a little bit more meat on the bones, more backstory and development so that I get more invested in these characters and I care more about the consequences of their decisions. I think the combination of this being a comic book as well as a shorter story, just really had an effect on it. The visuals of the comic book itself actually do, I think, help, but I think the story itself could have been slowed down to let us really absorb and take in some of these plot points. Now, the same goes for the characters, which is why I also ended up giving the names a 6.5 out of 10. The dialogue is pretty straightforward. I think that if we're gonna do comic books, facial expressions and body language are crucial. And I think I would have just liked to see more of that. Like, we got a lot of stills of them talking to each other back and forth, but I think showing the emotion on their faces would have given us more to invest in. I think that's really where we could have been shown a lot of things with the story, and so I do think that there's a little bit of a missed opportunity there. The character motivations also felt a little bit shallow at times. The king was probably the most compelling, especially the imagery of him alone on the throne. It added this layer of loneliness and misery that just really worked. But why he loved Seamus so much more than his son just did not add up to me. That just didn't make sense in the story in my mind. Overall, I think the characters could have used a little bit more complexity just to make them more relatable. Like, I actually think the villains of this story had more depth and intrigue than the actual protagonists. And so it just makes it harder for me to invest in them. When it comes to the magic, I had to give it a 5.5 out of 10. If I'm being completely honest, nothing here really blew me away. The wizard's powers were pretty standard, and the unicorn's main power is, well, basically killing vampires. I would have loved to see a more creative use of magic, especially since a unicorn as the main character opens up so many possibilities. We also hear that there's supposed to be consequences to using magic, but I didn't really see a clear system or correlation there. It just honestly left me wanting more depth and just a more defined magical system. To me, it either has to be a really defined structure of a system if we're going to use the same kind of magical elements that other story used, or it has to be a completely unique take on a magical system that is interesting and new and engaging to keep me interested in that type of a thing. For the infrastructure, since it's a comic book, I'm going to include the imagery as part of this section as well. Overall, this wasn't too bad with a score of 7 out of 10. I do feel like the visuals matched the story pretty well and did keep me engaged reading throughout. Another thing this book does well is just the pacing. The story moves at a good clip, and I never really felt bogged down. The plot structure was solid, though a little bit predictable, and the prose was accessible, simple, but it does get the job done. Since it is a comic, the story is a lot shorter, and just a lot had to be packed into those pages. It did make for a quick read, but again, I really think the story would have benefited from slowing down a little bit and just giving a few of those key moments just room to breathe. Listen, this was my first comic book, so I might be grading this a little bit harsher than it deserves. I just literally have nothing to compare this to. So my personal enjoyment, I gave a 6 out of 10. I just don't know if comics would be my personal go-to format for fantasy. I just more prefer to get lost in the complexity and depth of a full-length novel and just allow my imagination to do most of the heavy lifting. But there is a huge audience and demand for comic books, so I think that having fantasy authors think about how to create comic books in this genre is a really good idea. I could definitely see Unicorn Vampire Hunter being great for younger readers to expose them to this genre. Something to introduce kids into fantasy in a very fun and approachable way. It's simple and easy to grasp, and I think that if you're a fan of comics or you want to get your kids into fantasy, this would be a really solid pick. But for me personally, I just missed the deeper dive that a novel offers. So that leaves Unicorn Vampire Hunter with an overall score of 6.2 out of 10. It's an ambitious project, combining fantasy storytelling with the visual demands of a comic book. So like I said, I hope to see this niche in the genre get explored a little bit more. So if you're a comic book fan, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Give this book a read and tell me what you thought of the art style, the story, and your overall experience. Remember that my review is just one perspective, so if you are a comic enthusiast, definitely chime in. I'd love to get your take on it. Now, obviously, since this is a comic book, we're going to give a shout out to the special review design portion. I really like the cover. It has almost like a movie poster kind of a feel to it with the assembly of all these characters. And I think it works really well. And it gives you a good promise of what you can expect from the actual graphics in the story. Just setting expectations for the art style, which is great. I think the character designs were really engaging, just to give you a little sneak peek, a little snippet of what some of these look like. Just I think really good visual imagery from these little boxes. And there's even extra art posters kind of at the back of the book, which was kind of just like a nice bonus after you're done reading. You get to look at different styles, different artistic takes on the comic book, which I thought was kind of fun. That looks so sick to me. I just feel like it gives a little more value as a little bonus to the overall package. So with that said, let's get this one added to the shelf. So, what did you think of this review? Will you be picking up Unicorn Vampire Hunter? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this video and want more indie fantasy recommendations, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.